Bolo'bolo by Hans Widmer. Originally published 1983. This text from theanarchistlibrary.org. A big hangover. Life on this planet isn't as agreeable as it could be. Something obviously went wrong on spaceship Earth. But what? Maybe a fundamental mistake when nature, or whoever it was, came up with the idea of man. Why should an animal walk on 2 feet and start thinking? It seems we haven't got much of a choice about that, though. We've got to cope with this error of nature, with ourselves. Mistakes are made in order to learn from them. In prehistoric times, our deal seems to have been not so bad. During the Old Stone Age, 50,000 years ago, we were only few. Food, game, and plants was abundant, and survival required only little working time and moderate efforts. To collect roots, nuts, fruits, and berries, don't forget mushrooms, and to kill, or easier still trap, rabbits, kangaroos, fish, birds, or deer, we spent about 2 or 3 hours a day. In our camps, we shared meat and vegetables and enjoyed the rest of the time sleeping, dreaming, bathing, making love, or telling stories. Some of us took to painting cave walls, carving bones or sticks, inventing new traps or songs. We used to roam about the country in gangs of 25 or so, with as little baggage and property as possible. We preferred the mildest climates, like Africa's, and there was no civilization to push us away into deserts, tundras, or mountains. The Old Stone Age must have been a good deal, if we can trust the recent anthropological findings. That's the reason we stuck to it for several thousands of years. A long and happy period, compared to the 200 years of the present industrial nightmare. Then somebody must have started playing around with seeds and plants and invented agriculture. It seemed to be a good idea. We didn't have to walk far away to get vegetables anymore. But life became more complicated and toilsome. We had to stay in the same place for at least several months, keep the seeds for the next crop, plan and organize work on the fields, and harvest also had to be defended against our nomadic hunter-gatherer cousins, who kept insisting that everything belonged to everybody. Conflicts between farmers, hunters, and cattle breeders arose. We had to explain to others that we had worked to accumulate our provisions, and they didn't even have a word for work. With planning, withholding of food, defense, fences, organization, and the necessity of self-discipline, we opened the door to specialized social organisms like priesthoods, chiefs, armies. We created fertility religions with rituals in order to keep ourselves convinced of our newly chosen lifestyle. The temptation to return to the free life of gatherer-hunters must always have been a threat. Whether it was patriarchal or matriarchal, we were on the road to statehood. With the rise of the ancient civilizations in Mesopotamia, India, China, and Egypt, the equilibrium between man and natural resources was definitely ruined. The future breakdown of our spaceship was programmed. Centralized organisms developed their own dynamics. We became the victims of our own creations. Instead of the 2 hours per day, we worked 10 hours or more on the fields and construction grounds of the pharaohs and the Caesars. We died in their wars, were deported as slaves when they needed us for that. Those who tried to return to their former freedom were tortured, mutilated, killed. With the start of industrialization, things were no better. To crush the peasant rebellions and the growing independence of craftsmen in the towns, they introduced a factory system. Instead of foremen and whips, they used machines. They dictated to us our work rhythms, punished us automatically with accidents, kept us under control in huge halls. Once again, progress meant working more and more under still more murderous conditions. From 1,440 hours per week in 1300, work rose to 3,650 hours in 1850. In 1987, it was 2,152 and rising. The whole society and the whole planet was turned into one big work machine. And this work machine was simultaneously a war machine for anybody, outside or inside, who dared oppose it. War became industrial, just like work. Indeed, peace and work have never been compatible. You can't accept to be destroyed by work and prevent the same machine from killing others. You can't refuse your own freedom and not threaten the freedom of others. War became as absolute as work. The early work machine produced strong illusions of a better future. After all, if the present was so miserable, the future must be better. Even the working class organizations became convinced that industrialization would lay the basis for a society of more freedom, more free time, more pleasures. Utopians, socialists, and communists believed in industry. Marx thought that with its help, man would be able to hunt, make poetry, enjoy life again. Why the big detour? Lenin and Stalin, Castro and Mao, and all others demanded more sacrifice to build a new society. But even socialism only turned out to be another trick of the work machine, extending its power to areas where private capital couldn't or wouldn't go. The work machine doesn't care if it is managed by transnational corporations or state bureaucracies. Its goal is the same everywhere: steal our time to produce steel. The industrial work and war machine has definitely ruined our spaceship and its predictable future. The furniture, jungles, woods, lakes, seas is torn to shreds. Our playmates, whales, turtles, tigers, eagles, have been exterminated or endangered. The air, smog, acid rain, industrial waste, stinks and has lost all sense of balance. The pantries, fossil fuels, coal, metals are being emptied. Complete self-destruction, nuclear holocaust is being prepared for. We aren't even able to feed all the passengers of this wretched vessel. We've been made so nervous and irritable that we're ready for the worst kind of nationalist, racial, or religious wars. For many of us, nuclear holocaust isn't any longer a threat, but rather a welcome deliverance from fear, boredom, oppression, and drudgery. 3,000 years of civilization and 200 years of accelerated industrial progress have left us with a terrible hangover. Economy has become a goal in itself, and we're about to be swallowed by it. This hotel terrorizes its guests, even when we're guests and hosts at the same time. The planetary work machine, the name of the monster that we have let grow and that keeps our planet in its grips, is the planetary work machine. If we want to transform our spaceship into an agreeable place again, we've got to dismantle this machine, repair the damage it has done, and come to some basic agreements on a new start. So, our first question must be, how does the planetary work machine manage to control us? How is it organized? What are its mechanisms? And how can they be destroyed? It is a planetary machine. It eats in Africa, digests in Asia, and shits in Europe. It is planned and regulated by international companies, the banking system, the circuits of fuels, raw materials, and other goods. There are a lot of illusions about nations, states, blocks, first, second, third, or fourth worlds, but these are only minor subdivisions, parts of the same machinery. Of course, there are distinct wheels and transmissions that exert pressure, tensions, frictions on each part, on each other. The machine is built on its inner contradictions: workers' capital, private capital, state capital, capitalism, socialism, development, underdevelopment, misery, waste, war, peace, women, men, etc. The machine is not a homogeneous structure. It uses its internal contradictions to expand its control and to refine its instruments. Unlike fascist or theocratic systems, or like in Orwell's 1984, the work machine permits a sane level of resistance, unrest, provocation, and rebellion. It digests unions, radical parties, protest movements, demonstrations, and democratic changes of regimes. If democracy doesn't function, it uses dictatorship. If its legitimation is in crisis, it has prisons, torture, and camps in reserve. All these modalities are not essential for understanding the function of the machine. The principle that governs all activities of the machine is the economy. But what is economy? Impersonal, indirect exchange of crystallized lifetime. You spend your time to produce some part, which is used by somebody else you don't know, to assemble some device that is in turn bought by somebody else you don't know for goals also unknown to you. The circuit of these scraps of life is regulated according to the working time that has been invested in its raw materials, its production, and in you. The means of measurement is money. Those who produce and exchange have no control over their common product, and so it can happen that rebellious workers are shot with the exact guns they have helped produce. Every piece of merchandise is a weapon against us. Every supermarket is an arsenal. Every factory a battleground. This is the mechanism of the work machine. Split society into isolated individuals, blackmail them separately with wages or violence, use their working time according to its plans. Economy means expansion of control by the machine over its parts. making the parts more and more dependent on the machine itself. We are all parts of the planetary work machine. We are the machine. We represent it against each other, whether we're developed or not, waged or not, whether we work alone or as employees. We serve its purpose. Where there is no industry, we produce virtual workers to export to industrial zones. Africa has produced slaves for the Americas. Turkey produces workers for Germany, Pakistan for Kuwait, Ghana for Nigeria, Morocco for France, Mexico for the US. Untouched areas can be used as scenery for the international tourist business. Indians on reservations, Polynesians, Balinese, Aborigines. Those who try to get out of the machine fulfill the function of picturesque outsiders, bums, hippies, yogis. As long as the machine exists, we're inside it. It has destroyed or mutilated almost all traditional societies or driven them into demoralizing defensive situations. If you try to retreat to a deserted valley in order to live quietly in a bit of subsistence farming, you can be sure you'll be found by a tax collector, somebody working for the local draft board, or by the police. With its tentacles, the machine can reach virtually every place on the planet within just a few hours. Not even in the remotest parts of the Gobi Desert can you be assured of an unobserved shit. The three essential elements of the machine. Examining the machine more closely, we can distinguish three essential functions, three components of the international workforce, and three deals the machine offers to different fractions of us. These three functions can be characterized like this. A. Information. Planning, design, guidance, management, science, communication, politics, the production of ideas, ideologies, religions, art, etc., the collective brain and nerve system of the machine. B. Production. Industrial and agricultural production of goods, execution of plans, fragmented work, circulation of energy. C. Reproduction. Production and maintenance of A, B, and C workers, making children, education, housework, services, entertainment, sex, recreation, medical care, etc. All these three functions are essential for the functioning of the machine. If one of them fails, it will sooner or later be paralyzed. Around these three functions, the machine has created three types of workers to perform them. They're divided by their wage levels, privileges, education, social status, etc. A. Technical, intellectual workers. In advanced Western industrial countries, highly qualified, mostly white, male, and well-paid. A good example would be computer engineers. B. Agro-industrial workers and employees in not yet deindustrialized areas, in threshold countries, socialist countries, modestly or miserably paid, male or female, with wide-ranging qualifications. For example, automobile assembly workers, electronics assembly workers. C. Fluctuant workers, oscillating between small agricultural and seasonal jobs, service workers, housewives, the unemployed, criminals, petty hustlers, those without regular income, mostly women and non-whites in metropolitan slums or in the third world. These people frequently live at the edge of starvation. All these types of workers are present in all parts of the world, just in different proportions. Nevertheless, it's possible to distinguish three zones with a typically high proportion of the respective type of workers. A workers in advanced industrial Western countries, in the US, Europe, Japan. B workers in socialist countries or the newly industrializing countries, in the USSR, Poland, Taiwan, etc. C workers in the third world, agricultural or underdeveloped areas in Africa, Asia, and South America, and in urban slums everywhere. The three worlds are present everywhere. In New York City, there are neighborhoods that can be considered as part of the third world. In Brazil, there are major industrial zones. In socialist countries, there are strong A-type elements. But there is still a pronounced difference between the United States and Bolivia, between Sweden and Laos, and so on. The power of the machine, its control mechanism, is based on playing off the different types of workers against each other. High wages and privileges are not granted because the machine has a special desire for a certain kind of particular worker. Social stratification is used for the maintenance of the whole system. The three types of workers learn to be afraid of each other. They're kept divided by prejudices, racism, jealousy, political ideologies, economic interests. The A and B workers are afraid of losing their higher standard of living, their cars, their houses, their jobs. At the same time, they continually complain about stress and anxiety, and envy the comparatively idle C workers. C workers in turn dream of fancy consumer goods, stable jobs, and what they see as the easy life. All these divisions are exploited in various ways by the machine. The machine doesn't even need anymore a special ruling class to maintain its power. Private capitalists, the bourgeoisie, aristocrats, all the chiefs are mere leftovers, without any decisive influence on the material execution of power. The machine can do without capitalists and owners, as the examples of the socialist states and the state enterprises in the West demonstrate. These relatively rare fat cats are not the real problem. The truly oppressive organs of the machine are all controlled by just other workers, cops, soldiers, bureaucrats. We're always confronted with convenient metamorphoses of our own kind. The planetary work machine is a machinery consisting of people put up against each other. We all guarantee its functioning. So an early question is, why do we put up with it? Why do we accept to live a kind of life we obviously don't like? What are the advantages that make us endure our discontent? 3 deals in crisis. The contradictions that make the machine move are also internal contradictions for every worker. They're our contradictions. Of course, the machine knows that we don't like this life, and that it is not sufficient to oppress our wishes. If it were just based on repression, productivity would be low, and the cost of supervision too high. That's why slavery was abolished. In reality, one half of us accepts the machine's deal, and the other half is in revolt against it. The machine has indeed got something to offer. We give it a part of our lifetimes, but not all. In turn, it gives us a certain amount of goods, but not exactly as much as we want, and not exactly what we want. Every type of worker has its own deal, and every worker makes his or her own little extra deal, depending on particular job and specific situation. As everyone thinks he or she is better off than somebody else, there's always somebody worse off. Everybody sticks to his or her own deal, distrusting all changes. So the inner inertia of the machine protects it against reform and revolution alike. Only if a deal has become too unequal can dissatisfaction and readiness to change the situation arise. The present crisis, which is visible mainly on the economic level, is caused by the fact that all deals the machine has to offer have become unacceptable. A, B, and C workers alike have protested recently, each in their own ways, against their respective deals. Not only the poor, but also the rich are dissatisfied. The machine is finally losing its perspective. The mechanism of internal division and mutual repulsion is collapsing. Repulsion is turning back on the machine itself. The A deal. Disappointed at consumer society. What makes up the A deal? Steaks, good stereos, surfing, Chivas Regal, Tai Chi, Acapulco, Nouvelle Cuisine, Coke, skiing, exclusive discos, Alfa Romeos. Is this the machine's best offer? But what about those mornings while commuting, that sudden rush of angst, disgust, despair? We try to face that strange void, but in unoccupied moments between job and consuming, while we are waiting, we realize that time just isn't ours. The machine is duly afraid of these moments. So are we. So we're always kept under tension, kept busy, kept looking forward towards something. Hope itself keeps us in line. In the morning, we think of the evening. During the week, we dream of the weekend. We sustain everyday life by planning the next vacation from it. In this way, we're immunized against reality, numbed against the loss of our energies. The A deal hasn't become foul, or better, distinctly fouler, because a quantity or variety of consumer goods is lacking. Mass production has leveled out their quality, and the fascination of their newness has definitely disappeared. Meat has become somehow tasteless, vegetables have grown watery, milk has been transformed into just processed white liquid. TV is deadly dull, driving is no longer pleasurable, neighborhoods are either loud and crowded and unsafe, or deserted and unsafe. At the same time, the really good things like nature, traditions, social relations, cultural identities, intact urban environments are destroyed, In spite of this huge flood of goods, the quality of life plummets. Our life has been standardized, rationalized, anonymized. They track down and steal from us every unoccupied second, every unused square foot. They offer us, some of us, quick vacations in exotic places thousands of miles away, but in our everyday lives, our maneuvering room gets smaller and smaller. Also for A workers, work still remains work. Loss of energies, stress, nervous tension, ulcers, heart attacks, deadliness, hysterical competition, alcoholism, hierarchical control and abuse. No consumer goods can fill up these holes made by work. Passivity, isolation, inertia, emptiness, these are not cured by new electronics in the apartment. Frenzied travel, meditation, relaxation workshops, creativity courses, zipless fucks, pyramid power or drugs. The ADO is poison. Its revenge comes in depression, cancer, allergies, addictions, mental troubles, and suicide. Under the perfect makeup, behind the facade of the affluent society, there's only new forms of human misery. A lot of those privileged A workers flee to the countryside, take refuge in sex, try to cheat the machine with magic, hypnosis, heroin, oriental religions, or other illusions of secret power. Desperately, they try to get some structure, meaning, and sense back into their lives. But sooner or later, the machine catches its refugees and transforms exactly their forms of rebellion into a new impotence of its own development. Sense soon means business sense. Of course, the A deal doesn't only mean misery, though A workers have indeed got some undeniable privileges. As a group, they've got access to all the goods, all the information, all the plans and creative possibilities of the machine. The A workers have a chance to use this wealth for themselves, and even against the goals of the machine. But if they act only as A workers, the rebellion is always partial and defensive. The machine learns quickly. Sectorial resistance always means defeat. The B deal. Frustrated by socialism. The B deal is the classic industry, worker, state deal. The positive aspects of this deal, from the worker's point of view, are guaranteed jobs, guaranteed incomes, social security. We call this deal socialism because it occurs in its purest form in socialist or communist countries. But the B deal also exists in many different versions in private capitalist countries: Sweden, Great Britain, France, even the USA. At the center of the B deal, there is a state. Compared to the anonymous dictatorship of the market and money, a centralized state does seem able to give us more security. It seems to represent society, i.e. us, and the general interest. And through its mediation, many B workers consider themselves their own bosses. Since the state has assumed essential functions everywhere, pensions, health services, social security, police, it seems to be indispensable, and any attack against it easily looks like suicide. But the state is really just another face of the machine, not its abolition. Like the market, it constitutes its anonymity by means of massification and isolation. But in this case, it's the party, or parties, bureaucracy, the administrative apparatus that fulfills its task. In this context, we're not talking about democracy or dictatorship. A socialist state could in fact be perfectly democratic. There's no intrinsic reason why socialism, even in the USSR, shouldn't become democratic one day. The form of the state itself, though, always means dictatorship. It's just a question of degree how democratically its legitimation is organized. We face the state, our state, as powerless individuals, provided with guarantees, which are just pieces of paper and do not establish any form of direct social control. We're alone, and our dependence upon state bureaucracy is just an expression of our real weakness. In periods of crisis, some good friends are much more important than our social security cards or our savings accounts. The state means fake security. In the socialist countries where the B deal exists in its pure form, there remains the same system of constraint, by wage and by work, as is found in the West. We all still work for the same economic goals, something like a socialist lifestyle, for which accepting some sacrifices might make sense, has emerged nowhere. Nothing like that is even planned. Socialist countries still use the same motivation systems as in the West: modern industrial society, Western consumer society, cars, TV sets, individual apartments, the nuclear family, summer cottages, discos, Coca-Cola, designer jeans, etc. As the level of productivity of these countries remains relatively low, these goals can only be partially reached. The B deal is particularly frustrating since it pretends to realize consumer ideals it is far from able to fulfill. But of course, socialism doesn't mean only frustration. It does have real advantages. Its productivity is low because the workers there exert a relatively high level of control over working rhythms, working conditions, and quality standards. Since there is no risk of unemployment and firing is difficult, the B workers can take it relatively easily. Factories are overstaffed, sabotage is an everyday event, absenteeism for shopping, alcoholism, black market entrepreneurship, and other illegal businesses are widespread. B deal workers are also officially encouraged to take it easier, since there are not enough consumer goods to go around, hence little incentive to work harder. Thus, the circle of underproductivity is closed. The misery of the system is visible in a profound demoralization, in a mixture of alcoholism, boredom, family feuds, ass-kissing, careerism. As the socialist countries become ever more integrated into the world market, underproductivity leads to catastrophic consequences. B deal countries can only sell their products by dumping them at below market prices, so B workers are actually exploited in low-wage industrial colonies. The few useful goods produced flow right to the West. Their continuing absence in their own countries are an additional reason for B worker anger and frustration. The recent events in Poland have shown that more and more B workers are refusing the socialist ideal. Understandably, there are great illusions about consumer society and by the possibility of reaching it through state economic means. Lech Walesa, for example, was fascinated by the Japanese model. A lot of people in socialist countries, for example East Germany, are beginning to realize that high productivity consumer society is just another type of misery, and certainly no way out. Both the Western and socialist illusions are about to collapse. The real choice isn't between capitalism and socialism. Both alternatives are offered by the one and the same machine. Rather, a new solidarity will be needed, not to build a better industrial society and to realize the affluent universal socialist consumer family, but to tie direct relations of material exchange between farmers and city dwellers, to get free from big industry and state. The B workers alone will not be able to accomplish this. The C deal, the development of misery. Before the industrial work machine colonized the actual third world, there was poverty. Poverty, that means that people possessed few material goods and had no money, though they still got enough to eat, and everything they needed for that way of life was available. Wealth was originally software. Wealth was not determined by things and quantities, but by forms, myths, festivals, fairy tales, manners, eroticism, language, music, dance, theater, etc. It's also evident that the way material pleasures are perceived is determined by cultural traditions and conceptions. The work machine has destroyed most of the wealth aspects of this poverty, and has left misery in its place. When the money economy hits poverty, the result is the development of misery, maybe even just development. Development can be colonialist, independent, managed by indigenous elites or bureaucracies, socialist, state capitalist, private capitalist, or some mix of these. The result, however, is always the same. Loss of local food resources, cash crops replace subsistence agriculture, blackmailing on the world market, terms of trade, productivity gaps, loans, exploitation, repression, civil wars among rival ruling cliques, military dictatorships, intervention by the superpowers, dependence, torture, massacres, deportation, disappearance, famine. The central element of the C deal is direct violence. The work machine deploys its mechanisms of control openly and without any inhibitions. The ruling cliques have the task of building up functioning centralized states, and for that reason, all tribal, traditionalist, autonomous, backward, and reactionary tendencies and movements must be crushed. The often absurd territorial boundaries they've inherited from the colonial powers have to be transformed into modern national states. The planetary work machine cannot do without well-defined, normalized, and stable parts. That is the sense of the actual adjustments in the third world, and for that goal millions have to die or are deported. National independence has not brought the end of misery and exploitation. It has only adjusted the old colonial system to the new requirements of the work machine. Colonialism wasn't efficient enough. The machine needed national masks, promises of progress, and modernization to get the temporary consent of the C workers. In spite of the subjective goodwill of many elites, e.g. Nkrumah, Nier, etc., development has only prepared the ground for a new attack by the work machine, has demoralized and disillusioned the sea masses. For the sea workers, the family is at the center of their deal, eventually the clan, the village, the tribe. Sea workers cannot rely on the money economy, since wage work is scarce and miserably paid. The state isn't able to grant any social guarantees. So the family is the only form for even minimal social security. Yet the family itself has an ambiguous character. It provides safety amidst ups and downs, but at the same time, it is also another instrument of oppression and dependence. That's true for the sea workers all over the world, even in industrialized countries, especially so for women. The work machine destroys family traditions and exploits them at the same time. The family yields a lot of unpaid work, especially by women. The family produces cheap labor for unstable jobs. The family is a place of work for the sea worker. The sea workers in developing countries find themselves in an enervating situation. They're called upon to give up the old family village, but the new can't yet give them a sufficient means of survival. So we come to the cities and have to live in slums. We hear of new consumer goods, but we can't earn enough to buy them. Simultaneously, our villages and their agricultural bases decay and become manipulated, corrupted, and abused by the ruling caste. At least the sea deal has the advantage of a relative lack of restraint in everyday life. A few new responsibilities. We aren't tied to jobs or to the state. We're not blackmailed with long-term guarantees, pensions, etc. We can take advantage of any opportunities right on the spot. In this regard, we still got some of the leftover freedoms of the old hunter-gatherers. Changes can easily be put into action, and the possibility of going home again to the village, or what's left of it, is a real security that A and B workers just don't have. This basic freedom is at the same time a burden, since every day means an entirely new challenge. Life is never safe, food has become uncertain, and risks are always high. Criminal bands, political cliques, quick profiteers exploit this fact and easily recruit hustlers, pushers, and other mercenaries. In spite of the endless commercial advertising and development propaganda, more and more sea workers are realizing that the proposed consumer society will always remain a fata morgana. At best, a reward only to the upper 10% for their services to the machine. Capitalist and socialist models have failed, and the village is no longer a practical alternative. As long as there is only choice between different styles of misery, there is no way out for the sea workers. On the other side, they have got the best chances for a new way of life based on self-sufficiency, since industrial and state structures are growing very weak, and many problems like energy, shelter, even food are obviously much easier to solve locally than in metropolitan areas. But the sea workers as a class try to go back to their villages before the planetary work machine has been dismantled everywhere else. Too, they'll be doubly cheated. The solution is global, or it is not at all. The end of realpolitik. Misery in the third world, frustration in the socialist countries, deception in the West. The main dynamics of the machine are actually reciprocal discontent and the logic of the lesser evil. What can we do? Reformist politicians propose to tinker with the machine, trying to make it more humane and agreeable by using its own mechanisms. Political realism tells us to proceed by little steps. Thusly, the present microelectronic revolution is supposed to give us the means for reforms. Misery shall be transformed into mobilization. Frustration into activism, and disappointment shall be the basis of a change of consciousness. Some of the reformist proposals sound quite good. The 20-hour work week, the equal distribution of work on everyone, the guaranteed minimum income or negative income tax, the elimination of unemployment, the use of free time for self-management in towns and neighborhoods, mutual self-help, decentralized self-administration in enterprises and neighborhoods, the creation of an autonomous sector with low productivity small enterprise, investments in middle and soft technologies, also for the third world, the reduction of private traffic, the conservation of non-renewable energy, no nukes, investment in solar, public transportation systems, less animal protein in our diets, more self-sufficiency for the third world, the recycling of raw materials, global disarmament, etc. These proposals are reasonable, even realizable, and certainly not extravagances. They form, more or less, the official or secret program of the alternativist, socialist, green pacifist movements in Western Europe, the United States, and other countries. Should many of these reforms be realized, the work machine would look much more bearable, but even these radical reform programs only imply a new adjustment to the machine, not its demise. As long as the machine itself, the hard, heteronomous sector, exists, self-management and autonomy can only serve as a kind of recreational area for the repair of exhausted workers. And who can prevent that you won't get just as ruined in a 20-hour work week as you've been in 40? As long as this monster isn't pushed into space, it will continue to devour us. What's more, the political system is designed to block such proposals, or convert reforms into a new impulse for the further development of the machine. The best illustration for this fact are the electoral politics of reformist parties. As soon as the left gets the power, take a look at France, Greece, Spain, Bolivia, etc., it gets entangled in the jungle of realities and economic necessities, and has no choice but to enforce precisely those austerity programs it attacked when the right was in charge. Instead of Giscard, it's Mitterrand, who sends the police against striking workers. Instead of Reagan, it's Mondale, who campaigns against budget deficits. Socialists have always been good police. The recovery of the economy, i.e. the work machine, is a basis for every national politics. Reforms always have to prove that they encourage investment, create jobs, increase productivity, etc. The more the new movements enter real politics, like the Greens in Germany, the more they enter into the logic of healthy economy, or else they disappear. Besides destroying illusions, increasing resignation, developing general apathy, reformist politics don't achieve anything. The work machine is planetary. All its parts are interconnected. Any national reformist policy just makes for harder international competition, playing off the workers of one country against those of another, perfecting the control over all. It is exactly this experience with real politicians and reformers that have led more and more voters to support neoconservative politicians like Reagan, Thatcher, or Kohl. The most cynical representatives of the logic of economy are now preferred to leftist tinkerers. The self-confidence factor of the machine has grown shaky. Nobody dares anymore to believe fully in its future, but everybody still clings to it. The fear of experiments has outgrown the belief in demagogical premises. Why reform a system that's doomed anyway? Why not try to enjoy the few last positive aspects of the old personal or national deals with the machine? Why not put in charge positive, confident, conservative politicians? The ones who don't bother to promise to solve problems like unemployment, hunger, pollution, nuclear arms races. They're not elected to solve problems of this sort, but to represent continuity. For the recovery, only a little bit of calm, stability, positive rhetoric is needed. The security to cash in on profits made by present investments. Under these conditions, any recovery will be much more terrible than the crisis is. Nobody really has to believe in Reagan or Kohl. Just keep smiling along with them, forgetting about worries or doubts. The work machine in a situation like the present supports doubts very badly, and with the neoconservative regimes, you're at least left alone until the end of the next recovery, or catastrophe. Aside from agitation, bad moods, and remorse, the left has nothing additional to offer. Real politics is hardly realistic anymore, since reality is now at a turning point. All or nothing at all. The planetary work machine is omnipresent. It can't be stopped by politicians. So will the machine be our destiny until we die of heart disease or cancer at 65 or 71? Will this have been our life? Have we imagined it like this? Is ironical resignation the only way out, hiding from ourselves, our deceptions, for the few rushing years we've got left? Maybe everything's really okay, and we're just being overdramatic. Let's not fool ourselves. Even if we mobilize all our spirit of sacrifice, all of our courage, we can achieve not a thing. The machine is perfectly equipped against political kamikazes, as a fight of the Red Army faction, the Red Brigades, the Montoneros, and others has shown. It can coexist with armed resistance, even transform that energy into a motor for its own perfection. Our attitude is an immoral problem, not for us, much less for the machine. Whether we kill ourselves, whether we sell out in our own special deals, find an opening or a refuge, win the lottery or throw Molotov cocktails, join the Sparts or the Bhagwan, scratch our ears or run amok, we're finished. This reality offers us nothing. Opportunism does not pay off. Careers are a bad risk. They cause cancer, ulcers, psychosis, marriages. Bailing out means self-exploitation in ghettos, panhandling on filthy street corners, crushing bugs between rocks out in the garden of the commune. Cleverness has grown fatiguing. Stupidity is annoying. It would be logical to ask yourself some questions like these. How would I really like to live? In what kind of society or non-society would I feel most comfortable? What do I really want to do with myself? Regardless of their practicality, what are my true wishes and desires? And let's try to picture all this not in a remote future, where formalists always like to talk about the next generation, but in our own lifetimes, while we're still in pretty good shape. Let's say within the next 5 years. Dreams, ideal visions, utopias, yearnings, alternatives. Aren't these just new illusions to seduce us once again into participating in a scheme for progress? Don't we know them from the Neolithic, from the 17th century, from the science fiction and fantasy literature of today? Do we succumb again to the charm of history? Isn't the future the primary thought of the machine? Is the only choice that between the machine's own dream and the refusal of any activity? There's a kind of desire that, whenever it arises, is censored scientifically, morally, politically. The ruling reality tries to stamp it out. This desire is a dream of a second reality. Reformists tell us that it's short-sighted and egoistic to follow just one's own wishes. We must fight for the future of our children. We must renounce pleasures, that car, vacation, a little more heat, and work hard so that the kids will have a better life. This is a very curious logic. Isn't it exactly the renunciation and sacrifice of our parents' generation, their hard work in the 50s and 60s, that's brought about themes we're in today? We are already those children, the ones for whom so much work and suffering has gone on. For us, our parents bore, or were lost to, 2 world wars, countless lesser ones, innumerable major and minor crises and crashes. Our parents built, for us, nuclear bombs. They were hardly egoistic. They did what they were told. They built on sacrifice and self-renunciation, and all of this has just demanded more sacrifice, more renunciation. Our parents in their time passed on their own egoism, and they have trouble respecting ours. Other political moralists could object that we're hardly allowed to dream of utopias while millions die of starvation. Others are tortured in camps, disappear, are deported or massacred. Minimal human rights alone are hard to come by. While the spoiled children of consumer society compile their lists of wishes, others don't even know how to write, or have no time to even think of wishes. You look around a little, know anybody dead of heroin, any brothers or sisters in asylums, a suicide or 2 in the family, whose misery is more serious? Can it be measured? Even if there is no misery, would our desires be less real because others are worse off, or because we could imagine ourselves worse off? Precisely when we act only to prevent the worst, or because others are worse off, we make this misery possible, allow it to happen. In just this way, we're always forced to react on the initiatives of the machine. There's always an outrageous scandal, an incredible impertinence, a provocation that cannot be left unanswered. And so our 70 years go by, and the years of the others too. The machine has no trouble keeping us busy with that. It's a good way to prevent us from becoming aware of these immoral desires. If we start to act for ourselves, there would definitely be trouble. As long as we only react on the basis of moral differences, we'll be powerless as dented wheels, simply exploding molecules in the engine of development. And as we're already weak, the machine gets more power to exploit the still weaker. Moralism is one weapon of the machine, realism another. The machine has formed our present reality, trained us to see in the machine's way. Since Descartes and Newton, it has digitalized our thoughts, just like reality. It's laid its yes-no patterns over the world, over our spirits. We believe in this reality, maybe because we're so used to it. Yet as long as we accept the machine's reality, we're its victims. The machine uses its digital culture to pulverize our dreams, presentments, and ideas. Dreams and utopias are sterilized in novels, films, commercialized music. But this reality is in crisis. Every day, there are more cracks, and the yes-no alternative is much less an apocalyptic threat. The machine's ultimate reality reads self-destruction. Our reality, the second reality of old and new dreams, cannot be caught in the yes-no net. It refuses apocalypse and the status quo all at once. Apocalypse or evangel, Armageddon or utopia, all or nothing. These are the realest possibilities. In this reality, we choose one or the other, lightheartedly, but medium attitudes like hope, confidence, or patient are just ridiculous. Pure self-deceit. There is no hope, we have to choose now. Nothingness has become a realistic possibility, more absolute than the old nihilists dared dream of. In this respect, the machine's accomplishments must certainly be acknowledged. Finally, we've gotten nothingness. We do not have to survive. Nothingness has become a realistic alternative, with its own philosophy. Cioran, Schopenhauer, Buddhism, Glucksmann, its fashion, black, uncomfortable, music, housing style, painting, etc. Apocalyptics, nihilistics, pessimists, and misanthropists have all got good arguments for their attitude. After all, if you transform into values, life, nature, or mankind, there are only totalitarian risks, biocracy, or eco-fascism. You sacrifice freedom to survival. New ideologies of renunciation arise and contaminate all dreams and desires. The pessimists are the real free ones, happy and generous. The world will never again be supportable without the possibility of its self-destruction. Just as the life of the individual is a burden without the possibility of suicide. Nothingness is here to stay. On the other side, all is also quite appealing. It's of course much less probable than nothingness. Badly defined, poorly thought out. It's ridiculous, megalomaniacal, self-conceited. Maybe it's only around to make nothingness more attractive. Bolo'bolo. Bolo'bolo is part of my second reality. It's strictly subjective, since the reality of dreams can never be objective. Is Bolo'bolo all or nothing? It's both, and neither. It's a trip into second reality, like Yapfaz, Quendom, Takmas, and Ulso. Down there, there's a lot of room for many dreams. Bolo'bolo is one of those unrealistic, amoral, egoistic maneuvers of diversion from the struggle against the worst. Bolo'bolo is also a modest proposal for the new arrangement on the spaceship after the machine's disappearance. Though it started as a mere collection of wishes, a lot of considerations about the realization have been accumulated around it. Bolo'bolo can be realized worldwide within 5 years, if we start now. It guarantees a soft landing in the second reality. Nobody will starve, freeze, or die earlier than today in the transition period. There's very little risk. Of course, general conceptions of a post-industrial civilization are not lacking these days. Be it the eruption of the age of Aquarius, the change of paradigms, ecotopia, new networks, rhizomes, decentralized structures, soft society, the new poverty, small circuitry, third waves, or prosumer societies, the ecological or alternativist literature grows rapidly. Allegedly, soft conspiracies are going on, and the new society is already being born in communes, sects, citizens' initiatives, alternative enterprises, block associations. In all these publications and experiments, there are a lot of good and useful ideas, ready to be stolen and incorporated into Bolo'bolo. But many of these futures, or futurables, as the French say, are not very appetizing. They stink of renunciation, moralism, new labors, toilsome rethinking, modesty and self-limitation. Of course there are limits, but why should there be limits of pleasure and adventure? Why are most alternativists only talking about new responsibilities and almost never about new possibilities? One of the slogans of the alternativists is, think globally, act locally. Why not think and act globally and locally? There are a lot of new concepts and ideas, but what's lacking is a practical global and local proposal, a kind of common language. There has to be some agreement on basic elements, so that we don't stumble into the machine's next trap. In this regard, modesty and academic prudence is a virtue that risks disarming us. Why be modest in the face of impending catastrophe? Bolo'bolo might not be the best and most detailed or certainly a definitive proposal for a new arrangement of our spaceship, but it's not so bad and acceptable to a lot of people. I'm for trying it as a first attempt and seeing what happens later. Substruction. In case we'd like to try Bolo'bolo, the next question will be, how can we make it happen? Isn't it just another real political proposal? In fact, Bolo'bolo cannot be realized with politics. There's another road, a range of other roads to be followed. If we deal with a machine, the first problem is obviously -1. How can we paralyze and eliminate the machine's control, i.e., the machine itself, in such a way that Bolo'bolo can unfold without being destroyed at the start? We can call this aspect of our strategy deconstruction or subversion. The planetary work machine has to be dismantled carefully because we don't want to perish together with it. Let's not forget that we're parts of the machine, that it is us. We want to destroy the machine, not ourselves. We only want to destroy our function for the machine. Subversion means to change the relationships among us, the 3 types of workers, and towards the machine, which faces all workers as a total system. It is subversion, not attack, since we're still all inside the machine and have to block it from there. The machine will never confront us as an external enemy. There will never be a front line, no headquarters, no ranks, no uniforms. Subversion alone, though, will always be a failure, though with its help we might paralyze a certain sector of the machine, destroy one of its capabilities. Finally, the machine is always able to reconquer and occupy again. Every space initially obtained by subversion has instead to be filled by us with something new, something constructive. We cannot hope to eliminate first the machine, and then, in an empty zone, establish Bolo'bolo. We'd always arrive too late. Provisional elements of Bolo'bolo, seedlings of its structures, must occupy all free spaces, abandoned areas, conquered bases, and prefigurate the new relationships. Construction has to be combined with subversion into one process, substruction, or conversion if you prefer this one. Construction should never be a pretext to renounce on subversion. Subversion alone creates only straw fires, historical dates, and heroes, but it doesn't leave concrete results. Construction and subversion are both forms of tacit or open collaboration with the machine. Disco. Dealing first with subversion, it's clear that every type of work, anyone who functions for the machine in any part of the world, has his or her own specific potential for subversion. There are different ways of damaging the machine, and not everyone has the same possibilities. A planetary menu for subversion could be described a little like this. A. Disinformation, sabotage of hardware or programs, theft of machine time for games or any private purposes, defective design or planning, indiscretions, e.g. Ellsberg and the Watergate scandal, desertions, scientists, officials, refusal of selection by teachers, mismanagement, treason, ideological deviation, false information to superiors, etc. And effects can be immediate or quite long-term, seconds or years. B. Disproduction, opting out, low quality, manufacturing, sabotage, strikes, sick leaves, shop floor assemblies, demonstrations in the factories, use of mobility, occupations, e.g. the recent struggles of Polish workers. These effects are usually medium-term, weeks or months. C. Disruption, riots, street blockades, violent acts, flight, divorce, domestic rows, looting, guerrilla warfare, squatting, arson, e.g. Sao Paulo, Miami, Soweto, El Salvador. Effects here are short-term, hours or days. Of course, all these acts also have long-term effects. We're here only talking about the direct impact as forms of activity. Any of these types of subversion can damage the machine, can even paralyze it temporarily, but each of them can be neutralized by the 2 other forms. Their impact is different according to time and space. Disinformation remains inefficient if it is not used in the production or physical circulation of goods or services. Otherwise, it becomes a purely intellectual game and destroys only itself. Strikes can always be crushed if nobody, by disruptive actions, prevents the police from intervening. Disruption ends swiftly so long as the machine gets its supply from the production sector. The machine knows there will always be subversion against it, and that the deal between it and the different types of workers will always have to be bargained for and fought out again. It only tries to stagger the attacks of the three sectors so that they can't support and multiply each other, becoming a kind of counter-machine. Workers who have just won a strike, disproduction, are angry about unemployed demonstrators who prevent them, via a street blockade, from getting back to the factory on time. A firm goes bankrupt, and the workers complain about the poor managers and engineers. But what if it was a substructive engineer who willfully produced a bad design, or a manager who wanted to sabotage the firm? The workers still lose their jobs, take part in unemployment demonstrations, finally engage in riots, until the police workers come and do their jobs. The machine transforms a single attack of different sectors into idle motion, for nothing is more instructive than defeats, nothing more dangerous than long periods of calm. In this latter case, the machine loses the ability to tell what's going on inside the organisms of its body. The machine can't exist without a certain level of sickness and dysfunction. Partial struggles become the best means of control, a kind of fever thermometer, providing it with imagination and dynamism. If necessary, the machine can even provoke its own struggles, just to test its instruments of control. Disinformation, disproduction, and disruption would have to be joined on a mass level in order to produce a critical situation for the machine. Such a deadly conjecture could only come into being by the overcoming of the separation of the three functions and worker types. There must emerge a kind of communication that's not adequate to the design of the machine, discommunication. The name of the final game against the machine is thus ABC Disco. Where can such ABC Disco knots develop? Hardly where workers meet in their machine functions, that is, at the workplace, in the supermarket, in the household. A factory is precisely organized division, and things like unions only mirror this division, not overcome it. On the job, different interests are particularly accentuated. Wages, positions, hierarchy, privileges, titles, all of these build up walls. In the factories and offices, workers are isolated from each other. The noise, physical, semantic, cultural levels are high. Tasks are too absorbing. ABC Disco is not likely to happen best in the economic core of the machine. But there are domains of life, for the machine, mostly marginalized domains, that are more propitious for disco. The machine has individualized and rationalized everything. Often, in fact, not religion, mystic experiences, language, native place, nature, sexuality, desire, all kinds of spleens, crazy fixations, just plain fancy. Life as a whole still manages to slip away from the machine's basic pattern. Of course, the machine has long been aware of its insufficiency in these fields, and has tried to functionalize them economically. Religion can become sect business. Nature can be exploited by tourism and sport. The love of one's home can degenerate into an ideological pretext for the weapons industries. Sexuality can be commodified, etc. Basically, there's no need or desire that can't be merchandised. But as merchandise, it of course gets reduced and mutilated, and the true needs and desires move on to something else. Certain needs are particularly inappropriate for mass production. Above all, authentic, personal experience. Commodification succeeds only partially, and more people become aware of the rest. The success of the environmental movements, of the peace movement, of ethnic or regionalist movements, of certain forms of new religiousness, progressive or pacifist churches, of the homosexual subcultures, is probably due to this insufficiency. Where identities that lie beyond the logic of the economy have been newly discovered or created, there can be found ABC knots. As war objectors, intellectuals, shopkeepers, women and men have met, homosexuals gather without primary regard for job identity, Navajos, Basques, or Armenians struggle together. A kind of new nationalism or regionalism overcomes job and education barriers. The Black Madonna of Częstochowa contributed in uniting Polish farmers, intellectuals and workers alike. It's no accident that in recent times, it's almost exclusively these types of alliances that have given movements certain strengths. Their substructive power is based on the multiplication of ABC encounters that have been possible in their frameworks. One of the first reactions of the machine has always been to play off against each other the elements of these encounters, re-establishing the old mechanism of mutual repulsion. The above-mentioned movements have only produced superficial and short-lived ABC disco. In most cases, the different types just touch each other on a few occasions and then slip back into their everyday division, as before. They created more mythologies than realities. In order to exist longer and to exert substantial influence, they should also be able to fulfill everyday tasks outside of the machine, should also comprise the constructive side of substruction. They should attempt the organization of mutual help, of moneyless exchange, of services, of concrete cultural functions in neighborhoods. In this context, they should become anticipations of belows, of barter agreements, of independent food supply, etc. Ideologies or religions are not strong enough to overcome barriers like income, education, position. The ABC types have to compromise themselves in everyday life. Certain levels of self-sufficiency, of independence from state and economy must be reached to stabilize such disco knots. You can't work 40 hours per week and still have the time and energy for neighborhood initiatives. ABC knots can't just be cultural decorations. They must be able to replace at least a small fraction of money income in order to get some free time. How these ABC disco knots will look, practically, can only be discovered on the practical level. Maybe they will be neighborhood centers, food conspiracies, farmer and craftsman exchanges, street communities, commune bases, clubs, service exchanges, energy co-ops, communal baths, carpools, etc. All kinds of meeting points, bringing together all three types of workers on the basis of common interests, are possible ABC discos. The totality of such ABC knots disintegrates the machine, producing new subversive conjunctures, keeping in motion all kinds of invisible movements, diversity, invisibility, flexibility, the absence of names, flags, or labels, the refusal of pride or honor, the avoidance of political behavior, and the temptations of representation, can protect such knots from the eyes and hands of the machine. Information, experiences, and practical instruments can be shared in this way. ABC disco knots can be laboratories for new, puzzling, and surprising forms of action, can use all three functions and the respective dysfunctions of the machine. Even the brain of the machine has no access to this wealth of information, since it must keep divided the very thinking about itself, the principle of divided responsibility and competence. ABC disco knots are not a party, not even a kind of movement, coalition, or umbrella organization. They're just themselves, the culmination of their single effects. They might meet in a punctual mass movement, testing their strength and the reaction of the machine, and then disappear again into everyday life. They combine their forces where they meet each other in a practical task. They're not an anti-machine movement, but they are the content and material basis for the destruction of the machine. Due to their conscious non-organizedness, ABC knots are always able to create surprises. Surprise is vital, as we're at a fundamental disadvantage when faced with the machine, one that cannot be easily overcome. We can always be blackmailed by the constant threats of death or suicide pronounced by the planetary machine. It can't be denied that guerrilla warfare as a means of subversion can be necessary in certain circumstances, where the machine is already engaged in killing. The more ABC knots, networks, and tissues there are, the more the machine's death instinct is awakened. But it's already part of our defeat if we have to face the machine with heroism and readiness for sacrifice. Somehow, we have to accept the machine's blackmailing. Whenever the machine starts killing, we have to retreat. We shouldn't frighten it. It has to die in a moment when it least suspects. This sounds defeatist, but it's one of the lessons we have to learn from Chile, from Poland, from Grenada. When the struggle can be put on the level involving the police or the military, we're about to lose. Or if we do win, it's exactly our own police and military that will have won, not us at all. We'll end up with one of those well-known revolutionary military dictatorships. When the machine takes a raw killing, we have obviously made a mistake. We must never forget that we are also those who shoot. We're never facing the enemy, we are the enemy. This fact has nothing to do with the ideologies of non-violence. The most violent ideologies often refrain from killing. Damage to the machine and violence are not necessarily linked. Nor, however, does it serve us to put flowers into the buttonholes of uniforms, or go out of our way to be nice to the police. They can't be swindled by phony symbolism, arguments, or ideologies. They are like us. Still, maybe the cop has some good neighbors. Maybe the general is gay. Maybe the guy in the front lines has heard from his sister about some ABC disco knot. When there get to be enough discos, there are also enough security leaks and risks for the machine. We will, of course, have to be careful, practical, discreet. When the machine kills, there aren't yet enough ABC discos. Too many parts of its organism are still in good health, and is trying to save itself with preventative surgery. The machine won't die of frontal attack, but it can very well die of ABC cancer, learning about it only too late for an operation. These are just the rules of the game. Those who don't respect them better get right out. Let them be the heroes. Substruction as a general strategy is a form of practical meditation. It can be represented by the following yantra, combining substruction, the movement aspect, with below, the future basic community. Trico. The work machine has a planetary character, so a successful below strategy must also be planetary from the outset. Purely local, regional, or even national disco knots would never be sufficient to paralyze the work machine as a whole. West, East, and South must start simultaneously to subvert the respective functions inside the machine and create new, constructive anticipations. What's true for 3 types of workers on a micro level is also true for the 3 parts of the world on a macro level. There must be planetary disco knots. There must be tri-communication between disco knots. Trico, the planetary trico trick. Trico is disco between ABC knots in each of the 3 major parts of the world. Western industrial countries, socialist countries, underdeveloped countries. A trico knot is the encounter of 3 local ABC knots on an international level. Anticipations of belows must be established outside of governments, away from existing international organizations or development aid groups. The contacts must function directly between neighborhoods, between everyday initiatives of all kinds. There must be a trico between St. Mark's Place in New York's East Village, Northeast 7 in Gdansk, Poland, and Motumbiu in Nigeria. Or perhaps Zurich Staffaker, Novosibirsk Block A23, and Fuma, Fiji Islands. First trico knots could first originate on the basis of accidental personal acquaintances, tourist trips, etc. Then they could be multiplied by the activity of already existing tricos. The practical use of the trico knot, and there must be one, can be very trivial in the beginning. The exchange of necessary goods, medicine, records, spices, clothes, equipment, done moneylessly, or at least as cheaply as possible. It's obvious the conditions of exchange of goods are far from equal among 3 parts of the world. The third world partner in a trico will need a lot of basic products to make up for the exploitation by the world market. Third world communities will also need a lot of material for the construction of basic infrastructure, fountains, telephones, generators. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean that a trico is just a type of development aid. The partners will be creating a common project. The contact will be person to person. The aid will be adapted to real needs and based on personal relationships. Even under these conditions, exchange won't necessarily be one-sided. A workers in a disco knot will give a lot of material goods, as they have plenty, but they'll get much more in cultural and spiritual goods in return. They'll learn a lot about lifestyles and traditional settings, about the natural environment, about mythologies, other forms of human relations. As we've said before, even the most miserable C deals offer some advantages. Instead of frightening our A selves with the disadvantages of other deals, we'll exchange those elements that are still valuable and strong. The trico knots permit the participating ABC disco knots to amass the mutual illusions of their deals, and assist in stopping the division game of the work machine. Western discos will learn about socialist everyday life, ridding themselves of both red-baiting anti-communism and ridiculous socialist propaganda. The Eastern partners will find themselves giving up their impossible fantasies about the Golden West, and at the same time will be better able to immunize themselves against the official indoctrination in their own countries. Third world discos will protect themselves from development ideologies. socialist demagoguery, and blackmail by misery. All this won't be foisted off as an educational process, but will be a natural consequence of tri-communication. A Western disco knot might help the Eastern partner get a Japanese stereo. Needs are needs, even those created by the machine's advertising strategies. In the process of trico expansion, of closer exchange, and of growing Bolo'bolo structures, authentic wishes will become predominant. Dances and fairy tales from Dahomey will be more interesting than TV game shows. Gritty Russian folk songs will sound more attractive than Pepsi jingles, etc. Planetary substruction from the beginning is a precondition for the success of the strategy that leads to Bolo'bolo. If Bolo'bolo remains just a spleen of a single country or region, it's lost. It will become just another impulse for development on the basis of tri-communication. Those planetary relationships come into being that will disintegrate nation-states and the political blocs. Like the disco knots, the trico knots will form a substructive network that'll paralyze the work machine. Out of tricos will come barter agreements, phenos, general hospitality, scylla, new culturally defined regions, sumi, and a planetary meeting point, asa de la. The trico network will also have to block the war machines of single countries from the inside, thus proving to be the real peace movement, simply because they're not primarily interested in peace, but because they've got a common positive project. Provisional schedule. If everything works out well, Bolo'bolo can be realized by the end of 1987. We're responsible ourselves for the delays. The following schedule may be useful to judge our progress. 1984. Bolo'bolo pamphlets, stickers, posters, and signs are spread worldwide in the major languages. ABC disco knots develop in many neighborhoods, cities, and regions. Contacts of self-sufficiency are created. There are the first trico knots. Some discos get transformed into pioneer and experimental belows. In some neighborhoods, people study the usefulness of buildings and spaces for belows, exchange centers, and the like, and make other provisional plans. More and more streets are blocked to automobile traffic. The political machine suffers everywhere from heavy legitimation crises and has trouble maintaining control. State organs fulfill their repressive functions slovenly and inattentively. 1985. There are disco and trico networks, fulfilling more and more practical, everyday tasks. Mutual help for food, planetary help, the creation of exchange relationships between farmers and country discos. In certain smaller regions, the machine loses its influence and independent Bolo'bolo areas develop unperceived. State apparatuses suffer from substruction attacks. 1986. Larger regions become independent, among others, in Oregon, Tajikistan, Saxony, Wales, Switzerland, Australia, Ghana, Brazil. In these areas, agriculture is modeled on self-reliance. Bolo'bolo structures are built up, planetary exchange is strengthened. Toward the end of the year, there exists a planetary leopard skin of regions, autonomous countries, Udo, single belows, leftovers of the machine, amputated states, military bases. General disorder breaks out. The machines try to crush the belows militarily, but the troops mutiny. The two superpowers give up their block game and unite in the USSR, United Stable States and Republics. The USSR builds up a new, purified industrial base in Inner Asia, Monomot. 1987. The international systems of transportation and communication collapse. 200 autonomous regions hold their first planetary convention, Asa de la, in Beirut. They agree to reestablish the communication system on a new basis. The USSR is limited to Monomot, and the rest of the world slips away from its control. In the fall, there's self-sufficiency everywhere, and planetary systems of mutual emergency aid. Hunger and states are abolished. Towards the end of the year, the Monomot workers desert and flee into the below zone. The USSR disappears without formal dissolution and without having burned its red and white flag with a blue star. 1988 to 2345. Bolo'bolo. 2346. Bolo'bolo loses its strength as the whites, a kind of cultural epidemic, spreads and replaces all other types of Bolos. Bolo'bolo lapses into an age of chaos and contemplation. 2763. Beginning of Uvuo. All records on prehistory up to 2763 have been lost. Tao Huac puts a new floppy disk into the drive.